Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really drilling down into the absolute blueprint of U.S. lawmaking.
Like foundation itself?
Exactly. You sent us a fantastic stack of source materials, and they're all focused squarely on this one core document, or I should say, one part of a document.
Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
The part that defines the powers of the United States Congress.
And these powers, they're the bedrock of all federal law, but they're also incredibly specific, sometimes almost arcane sounding.
And yet, and this is the paradox, right? Through centuries of court cases and interpretation, they've become unbelievably flexible.
Elastic is the word I always come back to. They can be stretched to cover things the founders could have never possibly imagined.
That's our mission for this deep dive. We want to break down what Congress can do, but just as importantly, what it cannot do. We want to show you how these landmark court cases have, well, interpreted these rules, and how these very specific grants of power have morphed into these powerful levers of control that, they touch almost every part of our lives today.
And you really can't understand modern America, modern federal government, without getting a handle on that tension between the specific text and the flexible application.
So where do we start? Before we get to the big elastic powers, we have to start with the fundamental rule, the thing that's supposed to hold it all in check.
Yes, the foundational constraint. It's something that often gets lost in the sheer size and scope of the federal government today, but it is the entire basis of the system.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're talking about the concept of limited government.
Precisely. This is the very heart of the 10th Amendment. It's so clear. It says the federal government does not have what's called plenary power.
And plenary just means unlimited.
Unlimited, exclusive, total. It doesn't have it. Instead, the federal government can only use powers that are specifically enumerated, written down, listed in the Constitution.
So the rule of thumb is, if the power isn't on the list,
it doesn't belong to Congress. It's reserved for the states or for the people themselves.
And this is not just a theoretical point. It has massive, real-world implications.
Huge. Think about it this way. If, say, the state of California wants to pass the new law about what schools have to teach, they generally can. That's a power they've always had.
It was never given away to the federal government.
Right. But if Congress tries to pass that exact same law for the whole country, they can't just say, well, we think this is a good idea.
No, they have to do more.
They have to point to a specific clause in the Constitution, something like the Commerce Clause or the Spending Clause. And they have to build a legal argument that says, this is our constitutional hook. This is why we have the authority to do this.
Which leads us to maybe the single most critical constraint that all the sources hammer home. Congress has no general police power.
It's such a powerful phrase.
But what does it mean on a practical level? What is police power?
It means Congress cannot pass laws just for the general health, safety, welfare, or morals of the country.
Just because it's a good thing to do.
Exactly. That power, the power to regulate for public health and safety, that's the traditional police power, and it's reserved almost entirely for the states.
So if you hear about a new federal law and the justification is just, this will make people safer, or this will improve society's morals,
you should be skeptical. You should immediately ask, okay, but what's the constitutional anchor? Is this tied to commerce? Is it a tax? Is it related to national defense? It has to be tied to something on the list.
So Congress can't just pass a big, sweeping National Anti-Crime Act simply because crime is bad.
No. They have to frame it differently. They'll argue that the law is really about regulating the interstate trade in weapons, or it's about spending federal money to help local police, or something like that.
Got it. So every federal law needs that anchor.
Every single one. And the anchor they use more often than any other, the one that has been the source of the greatest expansion of federal power.
Yeah.
Well, that's where we're going first.
The engine of lawmaking itself.
The Commerce Clause.
Okay, let's get into it. This is where the rubber really meets the road. If the federal government wants to regulate, almost anything today.
Air quality, workplace safety, the minimum wage, what kind of crops a farmer can grow.
They almost always start their legal argument with the Commerce Clause. It truly is the engine of modern federal regulation.
And you find the text in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. It gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes.
On the surface, that sounds pretty straightforward. It sounds like rules for shipping goods across state lines, trade.
That's what most people thought for the first 100 years or so. But the courts, especially in the 20th century, have broadened the definition of commerce so far beyond just buying and selling.
How broad is it now? I mean, what counts as commerce in the modern legal sense?
It's breathtakingly broad. Today, commerce includes essentially any and all activity that involves or substantially affects two or more states.
So not just the goods themselves.
Oh, no. We're talking about transportation,
Mhm.
traffic, the movement of people, but it's also the transmission of intangible things.
Like what?
Gas in a pipeline, electricity on a grid, radio waves, television signals, mail, telephone calls, internet data. If it flows across a state line, or if it uses the infrastructure that allows things to flow across state lines, the Supreme Court has said that is commerce.
That is a massive, massive umbrella. So to try and bring some kind of order to this, to make this power manageable, the Supreme Court, in a really important case, United States v. Lopez, it laid out a framework.
That's a roadmap. They said Congress can use this power to regulate three distinct categories of activity.
Okay, what's Category 1?
Category 1 is the most direct, the most obvious. Congress can regulate the channels of interstate commerce.
And when we say channels, we literally mean the pathways, the roads, the rivers.
Exactly. The physical infrastructure. Think of the interstate highway system, major rail lines, navigable rivers like the Mississippi, even airspace.
So a scenario here would be Congress setting a national speed limit for trucks on interstates.
Perfect example. Or setting safety standards for bridges. Or mandating what kinds of boats can operate in major shipping lanes. They are regulating the channel itself to keep commerce flowing safely and efficiently. It's a very straightforward, rarely contested power.
Okay, that makes sense. So from the pathway itself, we move to Category 2.
Category 2 is regulating the instrumentalities of interstate commerce.
So not the road, but the things on the road.
Precisely. The people, the machines, the things that are used to conduct the commerce.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the trucks, the trains, the airplanes, the boats.
So an example here.
If Congress passes a law requiring all commercial trucks to have specific types of brakes or emission controls.
They're regulating the instrumentality, the truck.
Yes. Or if they set licensing and training standards for airline pilots. The pilot and the plane are both instrumentalities of commerce. Again, this is a pretty well accepted and direct form of regulation.
And then we get to Category 3, the one that is by far the most powerful and the most controversial.
This is where the power becomes truly elastic. Regulating activities that substantially affect interstate commerce.
This is where Congress starts reaching into areas that seem purely local, happening entirely inside one state.
This is really the necessary and proper clause working in tandem with the Commerce Clause. The rule is that Congress can regulate any activity, even if it's non-commercial and happens entirely within one state's borders, as long as there is a rational basis for concluding that that activity, when you look at it nationwide, has a substantial effect on the flow of interstate commerce.
This is where almost all modern federal regulation lives.
Environmental laws, financial regulations, workplace safety rules. Most of them are justified under this third category.
But let's talk about a really critical limit the Supreme Court put on this category, and it came up in the huge healthcare debate.
Yes.
Even with all this power, the court said Congress cannot use the Commerce Clause to force individuals who are not doing something to start doing something.
Right. It can't regulate inactivity. This takes us straight to the big challenge to the Affordable Care Act, specifically the individual mandate.
The part of the law that said you have to buy health insurance or pay a penalty.
In that case, NFIB v. Sebelius, Congress's argument was that the decision to not buy insurance has a massive effect on the interstate healthcare market.
And it does, right? When uninsured people get sick, the costs get passed on to everyone else in the form of higher premiums. That sounds like a textbook substantial effect.
The court actually agreed with that part. They agreed the economic effect was huge. But they drew a line in the sand, a very important one.
What was the line?
They said the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate existing commercial activity. It does not give them the power to create commercial activity by compelling people to buy a product they don't want.
So they can regulate the insurance I do buy, but they can't make me buy it in the first place.
That was the majority's reasoning. They said if Congress could force you to buy insurance because your failure to buy it affects the market, then what couldn't they do?
The classic example was forcing people to buy broccoli.
Exactly, or forcing people to buy a GM car to prop up the auto industry. The court worried that allowing Congress to regulate inactivity would erase any meaningful limit on federal power and would give it that forbidden general police power.
So it's the difference between a regulation and a command. That's a crucial distinction.
It is. But now let's pivot back to the mechanism that still gives Congress this phenomenal power over what looks like purely local economic behavior.
The power of aggregation.
This is the key. This is how Congress can reach into your backyard, literally.
This is where things get really, really interesting. We're talking about regulating something that one person is doing on their own property, entirely within one state. How is that possibly interstate commerce?
Through this idea of aggregation, the court applies what's called the substantial economic effect test, but they look at it nationally.
So my individual action doesn't matter so much?
Your individual action might be a tiny drop in the bucket, but Congress can still regulate it if the total incidence, that is, the combined effect of everyone across the country doing that same thing, would substantially affect the national market.
A tiny action becomes regulatable if it's part of a big national trend.
That's the logic. And the classic foundational case for this is from 1942, Wickard v. Filburn.
Yeah.
This case, it fundamentally changed the balance of power in America.
Okay, tell us the story of Farmer Filburn and his wheat. It's such a great example.
So this is happening during the Great Depression. The national economy is in shambles, and farm prices had totally collapsed. So Congress passes the Agricultural Adjustment Act to try and stabilize prices by setting limits on how much of a certain crop, like wheat, farmers could grow.
They were trying to control supply to boost the price.
Exactly. So here comes Roscoe Filburn, a farmer in Ohio, and he's mostly compliant, but he grows about 23 acres of wheat over his federal allotment.
And the federal government comes after him for it.
They do. And his defense is simple. He says, look, this extra wheat never entered commerce. I'm not selling it. I'm not shipping it across state lines. I'm using it right here on my own farm to feed my own livestock and for my family to bake bread.
It sounds like the very definition of a purely local, non-commercial activity. The kind of thing a state should regulate, if anyone.
It seems that way. But the Supreme Court sided with the federal government unanimously.
And their reasoning was pure aggregation.
Pure aggregation.
Yeah.
The court reasoned that, okay, Mr. Filburn's extra wheat by itself is trivial, but what if we let every small farmer in the country do the same thing?
The combined effect would be massive.
It would be substantial. And here's the clever part of the logic. Why does it affect the market? Because when Farmer Filburn grows his own wheat to feed his own chickens.
He's not going to the market to buy feed for his chickens.
Exactly. He is satisfying his own demand internally. By doing so, he is withholding his demand from the national marketplace, which reduces the overall demand and undermines the price support system Congress was trying to create.
Wow, so even though his action was local and non-commercial, the court saw it as part of a national economic web.
That's it. So his individual action, when seen as part of that collective whole, could be restricted by Congress. This case basically gave Congress a green light to regulate almost any local economic activity that, when you add it all up, has an influence on the national economy.
That is a staggering logical leap. And the result is that for almost any activity you can label as economic, that substantial effect is basically just assumed now.
And we saw this exact principle come up again much more recently in 2005 in a case about medical marijuana.
This was Gonzales v. Raich.
Right. So in this case, California had passed a law legalizing the cultivation and use of marijuana, but only for personal medical use as prescribed by a doctor.
So again, an activity that was meant to be non-commercial and totally interstate within California's borders.
And yet the federal government argued that its federal ban on marijuana still applied, even to these medical patients, and the Supreme Court agreed.
Using the same aggregation logic from the wheat case.
The very same. The court found that even personal, non-commercial cultivation of marijuana is part of a single national market for that drug. If you allow people to grow it for personal use, even for medical reasons, it becomes incredible. It all comes down to federalism. They're worried about Congress using the Commerce Clause to completely swallow up the powers that have traditionally belonged to the states.
Let's use the Lopez scenario as a detailed example. Congress passes the Gun-Free School Zones Act.
Right, a federal law making it a crime to possess a firearm within a certain distance of a school.
And Congress's argument for why they could do this under the Commerce Clause was pretty elaborate.
It was. They argued that, well, gun violence in schools creates a dangerous learning environment that disrupts education. A poorly educated citizenry leads to a less productive workforce, and a less productive workforce hurts the national economy and therefore affects interstate commerce.
A chain of logic.
A long chain of logic.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court broke that chain. They struck the law down.
What was their reasoning?
The majority said that if they accepted that rationale, if they accepted that chain of inferences, then there is literally no activity in America that Congress couldn't regulate.
Anything could be tied back to the economy somehow.
Anything. They said that gun possession near a school is a non-economic criminal activity. It's something that states have always policed. The link to commerce was just too weak, too indirect, what they called too tenuous, and allowing it would effectively grant Congress that forbidden general police power.
It's the classic slippery slope argument. If we let them regulate this, there's nothing left for the states to do.
That's the core of it. And we saw the exact same logic in the Morrison case, which involved the Violence Against Women Act.
There, Congress tried to create a federal civil remedy for victims of gender-motivated violence.
And they made the same kind of argument. This violence affects women's ability to travel, to work, to participate in the national economy. The court struck it down again.
For the same reason.
Same reason. Gender-motivated violence, while a horrific crime, is a non-economic activity traditionally handled by state criminal and civil law. The court made it clear that even if Congress comes to them with a mountain of research showing an economic link, if the underlying activity itself is non-economic, that link has to be substantial and direct, not a long chain of possibilities.
So this is the dividing line. If the activity is economic, growing wheat, mining coal, selling a product, the aggregation power is immense.
Idaho's limitless.
But if the activity is non-economic, possessing a gun, committing an assault, the power is very weak, and the courts will likely step in to protect the state's traditional role.
That tension, economic versus non-economic, that is the ultimate battleground for the modern Commerce Clause. It's the line in the sand that preserves what's left of state sovereignty.
Okay, let's shift gears now. We've talked about regulation, but let's move to finance. Because if the Commerce Clause is the engine, the power to tax, and the power to spend, well, that's the fuel.
And they can be just as potent, if not more so, in shaping national policy.
We find this in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It sounds so simple.
It does. It says Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States.
So it grants two powers at once, taxing and spending.
Two sides of the same coin. The power of the purse.
Let's start with the taxing power. It seems incredibly broad. What's the test? What does a tax have to do to be considered constitutional?
The bar is very, very low. A federal tax will generally be upheld as long as it has a reasonable relationship to revenue production.
So as long as it brings in some money.
Even a little bit. The primary purpose of the tax doesn't have to be raising revenue. It can be designed to regulate or even punish a certain activity. But as long as it generates some income for the Treasury, it's usually considered a valid tax.
And what about that general welfare phrase? Does the tax have to be tied to one of Congress's other listed powers?
No, it does not. The court has interpreted the General Welfare Clause very broadly here. It means Congress can tax and spend for any public purpose that it believes serves the general welfare. They don't have to prove it's necessary.
That standard seems deliberately easy to meet. And this brings us right back to the Affordable Care Act.
The perfect example.
We just established that the individual mandate, the requirement to buy health insurance, failed under the Commerce Clause.
It did. The court said Congress couldn't compel commerce.
So how did the mandate survive?
It survived because the Supreme Court did a constitutional pivot. They said, okay, it's not a valid regulation of commerce, but it is a valid exercise of the taxing power.
How could it be a tax? It was called a penalty in the law.
The court looked past the label and looked at how it functioned. They reasoned that since the payment was collected by the IRS, it was based on income, and it produced revenue for the government, it looked and acted like a tax. So it was just a tax on the choice to not buy insurance.
That is just fascinating. Congress tries one door, it's locked. So they just go around and use a different key for another door.
It really shows the incredible flexibility Congress has. If one constitutional justification fails, another one might work just as well.
Okay, so when we're talking about taxes, the sources mention a key distinction between direct and indirect taxes.
Right. And the Constitution treats them differently. Indirect taxes, things like duties on imports, federal sales taxes, or excise taxes on products like gasoline or tobacco, they have to be geographically uniform.
And what does uniform mean in this context?
It just means the tax rate has to be the same in every state. A federal tax of 20 cents per gallon of gasoline has to be 20 cents in Florida and 20 cents in Alaska.
even if the final price of gas is totally different in those states.
Exactly. It's about the uniformity of the tax itself, not its economic effect.
And what about direct taxes? These are taxes on property or on people themselves.
Those are different. The Constitution originally required that direct taxes be apportioned among the states based on their population. This was incredibly complicated and politically difficult to do.
That logistical nightmare.
A total nightmare, which is why Congress has mostly avoided them throughout history. And of course, the biggest change in the entire history of federal power was an amendment that specifically addressed this.
The 16th Amendment.
The 16th Amendment, which gave us the modern income tax. It completely changed the game.
And its text is so clear. It says Congress can lay and collect taxes on income from any source without apportionment.
That one sentence unleashed a torrent of federal power and funding. And the sources point out just how broadly Congress can define income for tax purposes. It can reach deep into really complex financial setups.
Can you give us a modern example of that reach?
Sure, there was a recent case in 2024, Moore v. U.S. The Supreme Court looked at a specific provision of the tax code that took the undistributed profits of a foreign company and attributed that income to its American shareholders and then taxed them on it.
Even though they hadn't actually received the money as a dividend yet.
That's right. And the court upheld it. They confirmed that Congress has extraordinary power to decide what counts as income for tax purposes, as long as it's generally related to some kind of realized gain at the entity level. It shows Congress's power to pierce the corporate veil and tax wealth in its various forms.
A huge validation of the 16th Amendment's power. Now, are there any absolute ironclad prohibitions on what Congress can tax?
Yes, there is one major one, the Export Taxation Clause.
Found in Article 1, Section 9?
Correct. It says Congress cannot tax any goods or services that are exported to foreign countries. This is interpreted very broadly. You can't put a tax on something at any point during its journey of exportation.
And one quick procedural note, the Origination Clause. Where do tax bills have to start?
They have to originate in the House of Representatives. But the courts have read this very narrowly. It only applies to bills that are primarily for levying taxes. If a bill has some other main purpose and just incidentally creates some revenue, it doesn't have to start in the House.
Okay, let's move to the other side of the purse. The spending power. You said Congress can spend for any public purpose. How does that translate into a tool for regulation?
The spending power is, if anything, even broader than the taxing power. As affirmed in U.S. v. Butler, Congress can spend money for the general welfare, which basically means any public purpose it can think of, whether or not that purpose is linked to another enumerated power.
So they can fund medical research, support the arts, give disaster relief.
All under the general welfare clause. But the real power, the true leverage, comes when Congress uses that money to get states to do things that Congress couldn't order them to do directly.
This is the idea of conditional spending.
The great leverage tool. Congress can attach strings or conditions to the federal money it hands out to the states. If a state wants the federal grant money, it has to agree to comply with the federal condition.
And this allows Congress to achieve national policy goals that are outside the scope of its direct regulatory powers.
It's a brilliant backdoor. And the classic scenario everyone learns is South Dakota v. Dole.
The national drinking age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s, Congress wanted a uniform national drinking age of 21 to combat drunk driving. But they couldn't just pass a law ordering states to set their drinking age at 21. That's a state police power.
So they used the spending power instead.
They did. Congress passed a law that said they would withhold a percentage, I think it was 5% at first, of a state's federal highway funding if that state did not raise its drinking age to 21.
And highway funding is a massive amount of money.
Billions of dollars. No state could really afford to turn it down. And the Supreme Court upheld this as a legitimate use of the spending power. They said it was a strong incentive, but it wasn't outright coercion.
But there have to be limits on this. Congress can't just attach any condition it wants the money, can it?
No, the court laid out a four-part test. First, the spending have to be for the general welfare. Easy enough. Second, the condition must be unambiguous so the states know exactly what they're signing up for. Third, the condition has to be related to the purpose of the spending program. In the Dole case, the court said a higher drinking age was related to safe interstate travel, which is the purpose of highway funds.
A bit of a stretch, but okay. And what's the fourth and most important limit?
The fourth limit is that the condition cannot be unconstitutional. For example, Congress couldn't require a state to ban a certain religion in order to get education funding. And Critically, the condition cannot be unduly coercive.
So it can't be a threat that the state has no real choice but to accept.
That's the line. And we saw the court enforce this line in the ACA case. The law threatened to take away all of a state's existing Medicaid funding, which, for most states, is a huge chunk of their entire budget if they didn't expand the program.
And the court said that was too much.
They said that was a gun to the head. It crossed the line from persuasion to coercion. So Congress can use a financial carrot, but it can't use a financial sledgehammer.
A delicate balance, but a critical one for federalism.
Absolutely.
All right, we have covered the two giant elastic clauses. Now let's turn to some of the more specific but absolutely crucial powers listed in Article 1. Let's start with the war and defense powers.
These powers are, fundamental to the survival of the nation. Article I gives Congress the power to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy.
And the courts have interpreted this authority as being exceptionally broad.
Extremely broad. There's a recognition that in times of national crisis or war, Congress and the president need the latitude to act decisively. The judiciary tends to be very differential in this area.
How far does this power extend into regulating the everyday civilian economy?
Very far. Historically, the court has upheld massive federal interventions in the name of national defense. This includes things like the military draft, the selective service system, even the power to exclude civilians from certain restricted areas.
And what about controlling the economy itself?
During and immediately after major wars like World War II, the court upheld Congress's power to institute wage and price controls. They could literally set the price of milk or the maximum rent for an apartment in New York City, all justified under the war power.
That is just an incredible amount of power. The idea that a war overseas gives Congress the power to freeze my rent.
It shows that in a true national emergency, the normal limits on federal power can become very, very flexible. But even these powers have checks, especially when we get into the area of military justice.
So Congress can create military courts or tribunals.
Yes, they can.
Who can legally be tried in these courts.
The law is very clear on this. They have jurisdiction over three groups: enemy soldiers, enemy civilians captured during a conflict, and current members of the U.S. Armed Forces.
Who is not on that list?
U.S. civilians. Military courts have absolutely no jurisdiction over American civilians, even if they're accused of treason or committing crimes alongside the military. Those cases have to go through the regular federal court system.
But what happens in that gray area where the U.S. captures one of its own citizens on a battlefield and labels them an enemy combatant, like we saw after 9/11?
That's where the Constitution's due process protections kick in. The landmark case here was Hamdi v. Rumsfeld.
And what did the court say?
The court ruled that an American citizen who was detained as an enemy combatant still has due process rights. They have to be given notice of the reasons for their detention, and they must have a fair opportunity to challenge that detention before a neutral decision maker.
So the government can't just lock up a citizen indefinitely without any review?
No. The label enemy combatant does not erase their citizenship and the rights that come with it.
And this ties into the even more fundamental right of habeas corpus.
Yes, the suspension clause. The court affirmed in Boumediene v. Bush that anyone being held in a territory where the United States has sovereign control, and they specifically said this includes the base at Guantanamo Bay, has a right to go to a federal court and have that court review the basis for their detention.
And that right can't be easily taken away.
No, it's one of the cornerstones of liberty. It can only be suspended in cases of rebellion or invasion when the public safety may require it.
Okay, let's bring it back home to domestic security and the National Guard. Most people think of the Guard as a state force under the governor's command.
And they are, for day-to-day purposes. But the Constitution gives Congress the ultimate authority.
The militia clauses.
That's right. They give Congress the power to organize and arm the militia and to authorize the president to call them into federal service, to enforce federal laws, suppress insurrections, or repel invasions.
And the key case here, Perpich v. Department of Defense, clarified the balance of power between the governor and the president.
It did. It established that when the president, authorized by Congress, calls up National Guard units for federal duty, that call-up is not subject to the state governor's approval or veto.
Even for training, exercises, or non-emergency situations.
Even then. When the Guard is called into federal service, the federal authority is supreme.
Let's quickly hit two other important express powers. First, the property power.
This is another one that's surprisingly powerful. It gives Congress absolute authority to regulate and dispose of all federal property and territory. Think of national parks, military bases, federal buildings.
And they can even regulate private land to protect that federal property.
Yes, if your private factory is spewing pollution onto a neighboring national forest, Congress can pass a law to stop you, using its power to protect its own property.
And second, the postal power.
One of the oldest federal powers, and it's an exclusive monopoly. Only the federal government can establish post offices and deliver the mail.
Can they control what goes in the mail?
To a point. They can impose reasonable, content-neutral restrictions. They can ban the mailing of fraudulent materials or explosives or obscene content. But they can't use that power to violate other constitutional rights. They can't, for example, refuse to deliver a magazine just because they don't like its political views. That would violate the First Amendment.
Okay, that brings us to our final section, how Congress polices the other branches and enforces its own laws. Let's start with a power that isn't even written down in the Constitution.
The investigatory power.
It's implied, right?
It's implied through the necessary and proper clause. The reasoning is simple. To write good laws, Congress needs good information. To get good information, it needs the power to investigate.
And what's the legitimate scope of a congressional investigation?
It has to be connected to what the court calls the sphere of legitimate legislative activity.
Meaning
Meaning it has to be related to something Congress can legislate on, so they can investigate how existing laws are working, whether new laws are needed, if there's waste or corruption in a federal agency, things like that.
But there are limits. They can't just haul a private citizen before a committee and grill them about their personal life.
Absolutely not. The primary limit is legislative purpose. The investigation can't be used just to expose someone's private affairs for the sake of exposure. And critically, Congress cannot act like law enforcement. It can't conduct a hearing for the purpose of proving someone is guilty of a crime and punishing them. That's the job of the executive and judicial branches.
And how does Congress compel people to cooperate, to testify, or turn over documents?
Through the subpoena power. A congressional committee can issue a legally binding subpoena, but that subpoena is only valid if it serves a legitimate legislative purpose.
We've seen a lot of court battles over this recently, especially with subpoenas directed at the president.
Yes, the case of Trump v. Mazars was very important here. The court said that while courts are usually reluctant to interfere with a congressional subpoena when that subpoena is aimed at the president's personal records, the courts have to step in and perform a careful balancing act.
A balancing act between Congress's need for information and
the need to protect the independence and functioning of the executive branch. It's a separation of powers issue. The court said Congress has to show a very specific and demonstrated need for that information that can't be met elsewhere.
Okay, now for a power where Congress has almost total authority. Power over non-citizens and citizenship.
When it comes to non-citizens trying to enter the country, Congress's power is plenary. It's full and almost absolute. A non-citizen has no constitutional right to come to the United States.
So Congress can deny entry for almost any reason.
Yes, even for reasons that would be unconstitutional if applied to a citizen, like their political beliefs.
But the moment a non-citizen is physically inside the United States, their rights change.
Fundamentally. The minute they're on U.S. soil, the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause attaches. They are now a person under the Constitution. This means that while they can still be deported, the government has to follow fair procedures. They are entitled to notice and a proper hearing before they can be removed.
And what about citizenship itself? Congress controls naturalization, the process of becoming a citizen. But can they take citizenship away?
That is extremely limited. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens. The court, in Afroyim v. Rusk, ruled that Congress cannot take away a person's citizenship unless it was obtained fraudulently in the first place.
So they can't strip your citizenship as a punishment for a crime?
No. Once you have it legitimately, it's yours.
Okay, finally, let's talk about some of the most complex and important enforcement powers Congress has, the ones from the Civil War amendments.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they were revolutionary, and each one ends with a clause giving Congress the power to enforce it with appropriate legislation.
And the key thing for you to understand as a listener is that the scope of that enforcement power is very different for each amendment.
That is the crucial takeaway. Let's start with the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Why is its enforcement power the broadest of the three?
Why is that?
Because the 13th Amendment is the only one of the three that directly regulates purely private conduct. It doesn't just apply to the government. Because of this, Congress's power to enforce it also extends to private action. The court has said Congress can legislate to eliminate the badges and incidents of slavery.
And badges and incidents can include modern-day racial discrimination.
Exactly. So if Congress passes a law banning racial discrimination in private housing or by private employers, its authority comes from the 13th Amendment. That's a power the other amendments don't give it.
Okay, so that brings us to the 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process and equal protection. Why is its enforcement power so much more limited?
Two big reasons. First, the 14th Amendment itself only applies to state government action, not to private individuals. So Congress's power to enforce it is also limited to remedying what states do.
And the second reason?
The second reason is that the Supreme Court has jealously guarded its own role as the final interpreter of what the 14th Amendment means. It says Congress's job is only to enforce the rights as the court has defined them. Congress cannot create new rights or expand the definition of existing rights.
And this is where the court came up with that test, congruence and proportionality.
Yes, from City of Bourne v. Flores. It's a crucial guardrail. It means the law Congress passes has to be a reasonable fit for the problem it's trying to solve. The remedy has to be congruent and proportional to the actual constitutional violation by the state.
So if only one or two states have a discriminatory law, Congress can't pass a giant sweeping national law that burdens all 50 states.
Precisely. The hammer has to fit the nail. If the remedy is way out of proportion to the injury, the court will strike it down, saying Congress is trying to redefine the right, not just enforce it.
And quickly, the 15th Amendment, protecting the right to vote from racial discrimination. What are the limits there?
The main constraint that's emerged is this idea of equal sovereignty among the states. In Shelby County v. Holder, the court said that if Congress is going to pass a voting rights law that treats some states more harshly than others, like the old preclearance formula in the Voting Rights Act, it has to justify that unequal treatment with evidence of current, ongoing problems.
Old historical data isn't enough.
Right. It has to be based on the facts on the ground today.
Let's wrap up with Congress's power over itself, over its own members.
First, a key limit. Congress cannot add to or change the qualifications for being a member, which are set in the Constitution age, citizenship, and residency. The Supreme Court settled that in a case about term limits.
U.S. term limits v. Thornton.
That's the one. However, once a member is elected, each house has the power to police itself. It can punish a member for disorderly behavior, and it can expel a member with a 2/3 vote.
And finally, we just got a major clarification on the disqualification clause from the 14th Amendment, the part about insurrection.
Yes. The Supreme Court in Trump v. Anderson made it very clear that the power to disqualify a person from holding federal office for having engaged in insurrection rests exclusively with Congress.
So a state can't do it on its own?
No. The court affirmed that this is a national question to be resolved by the national legislature through legislation. It's another example of a specific enforcement power being reserved to Congress alone.
Wow. This has been a truly monumental deep dive. From the broadest powers to the most specific. If we try to boil this all down, what's the core takeaway about how our federal government actually works?
I think the core lesson is a paradox. On paper, the power of Congress is limited, it's enumerated. But in practice, it is fantastically flexible.
And that flexibility comes from the judicial interpretation of just a few key phrases.
That's it. The Commerce Clause, the Taxing Power, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. Those three, as interpreted by the courts, provide the legal foundation for nearly every major federal agency, program, and regulation that exists today.
We started this whole conversation with the idea of a limited government, but we ended up in a place where those limited powers allow Congress to regulate almost any economic activity, no matter how small, as long as the cumulative national effect is substantial.
It's a system built on this delicate, constantly shifting balance between specific hardwired powers, like the power to declare war, and these incredibly elastic phrases like general welfare that allow the government to adapt and grow.
So let's bring this back to you, the listener. What does this all really mean for your daily life? Remember that foundational story we talked about, the story of Farmer Filburn.
Congress was able to regulate the wheat he was growing just for his own family and his own animals. They could do it because of the aggregate effect, the combined impact of every farmer like him on the national economy.
That power of aggregation is still the law of the land. So here's a final thought to mull over. Consider everything you do locally that touches on supply or demand.
Could be a big vegetable garden in your backyard. That means you buy fewer groceries. It could be participating in a local tool-sharing library or a neighborhood bartering system.
If that aggregation principle is still so potent, how might Congress, if it wanted to, justify regulating those activities today using that same logic of total incidence? What does that tell you about where the real line is between federal power and your own choices in your daily life?
That's the constant constitutional question. And it's something to think about every time a new federal rule or regulation comes down the pike.
Indeed. We look forward to seeing what sources you send us for our next deep dive.
We'll see you then.